There are some men who walk through life like shadows. Their presence felt more in the space they occupy than the noise they make. They see things, hear things, every little tremor in the foundation, every shift in the wind, but they rarely speak of it. They navigate their days, sometimes through blinding fog, sometimes under a relentless sun, always with the quiet understanding that the world keeps spinning, regardless of their personal struggles. And we, the rest of us, we often mistake their silence for indifference, their focus for selfishness, failing to see the immense weight they carry, the burdens they bear in the quiet corners of their souls. We often believe that the biggest shifts in a man's life come from grand pronouncements or sudden explosions, a moment of divine revelation or a catastrophic collapse. But sometimes it's just a quiet click, a barely audible snap that changes everything. A realization, slow and creeping like the rust on an old machine, that the way you've been doing things, the way you've been living things, just isn't going to cut it anymore. And in that moment, a man can be reborn, not with a roar, but with a simple, steel-backed decision to simply be better. Vince was one such man. 48 years old, with a name that sounded like a punch, a single syllable that held a certain blunt force, but a demeanor that was more akin to a well-worn leather glove, strong, flexible, always ready for work, but showing the undeniable signs of age and countless battles. He worked at the sprawling metal beast of a manufacturing plant, a place that smelled permanently of hot oil, cut metal, and industrial-strength cleaner just off the interstate. For the better part of 25 years, he'd clocked in and out of the same place, assembling parts for machines that would then go on to assemble other parts for even bigger machines. It was an endless, churning cycle, and Vince had become as much a fixture as the presses themselves. His hands, the size of dinner plates, were calloused monuments to 4 decades of honest, brutal work. They were crisscrossed with thin, white scars, each a faint memory of a minor skirmish with a sharp edge, a stray spark, or a moment of carelessness. The knuckles were perpetually swollen, a testament to countless impacts, and the skin was ingrained with a fine, almost imperceptible film of grease and grime that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. They were workers' hands, plain and simple, capable of both delicate precision and bone-crushing force. His face was a map of his years, etched with the lines of concentration around his eyes, faint brackets around his mouth from unspoken thoughts, and a persistent furrow in his brow. His hair, once a dark brown, was now a salt and pepper mix, thinning slightly at the crown but still thick and stubborn like the man himself. His eyes, the color of faded denim, held a quiet strength, sure, a depth that hinted at experience and resilience. But they also carried a deep-seated weariness, a kind of existential tiredness that no amount of sleep on his lumpy mattress seemed to touch. It wasn't just physical fatigue. It was the kind that settled in the bones after years of carrying the weight of expectation, of responsibility, of silent worries. When he looked at you, he didn't just see your face. He seemed to register the subtle shifts in your posture, the unspoken anxieties flickering in your own gaze. He didn't say much, never had. Small talk was a foreign language he'd never bothered to learn. A nod for good morning, a grunt for good night, and an occasional, clipped instruction if the situation absolutely demanded it. Most people mistook it for gruffness, maybe even a lack of interest, a disinclination to engage. And maybe, for a long time, it was. He was just trying to get through the day, one foot in front of the other, one task at a time. But beneath that quiet, almost reserved surface, where most folks didn't bother to look, there was a man who felt things deeply, worried harder than he let on, and carried the weight of his small world with a kind of stubborn, unspoken pride. He had a deep-seated desire to protect and provide for those he cared about, a silent vow he made to himself every single day. Yet lurking within him was a persistent fear of failure, a quiet dread that he might not be enough, might not do enough, might not have enough. And despite all the burdens, all the hard-won cynicism, there was still a quiet hope for things to be better, a stubborn flicker that refused to be extinguished. Vince saw himself as a cog, a crucial one perhaps, but still just a part of a much bigger machine. His job was his, and yours was yours. He believed leadership was for the guys in the corner offices, the ones who wore ties and barked orders from behind glass. Not for a man like him, standing on a concrete floor, smelling of oil and sweat, with nothing but his 2 hands and a lifetime of know-how. He kept his head down, rarely offered help unless directly asked, and almost never intervened even when he saw a coworker struggling. It wasn't his place, he figured. Someone else's problem. That was what the supervisors were paid for. There's a quiet truth about the world, a simple law as old as the first campfire. Folks tend to believe what they see. And what we often see, especially in the big factories and the towering offices, is a boss at the head of the table, a supervisor with a clipboard, a manager with a corner office. We see titles and uniforms, and we call that leadership. We figure the man in charge, the one with the authority, is the one responsible for everyone else. It's a clean, simple line, easy to draw in the sand. But sometimes, just sometimes, that line gets blurry, smudged by the grit of real life, and you find out that the real power, the true heart of looking out for others, isn't always in the hands that sign the checks or bark the orders. It's in the hands that get calloused, the eyes that see past the job description, the spirit that understands a burden shared is a burden halved. It's in the quiet ones, the ones who seem to just blend into the roar of the machines, until life decides it's time for them to stand out, to step up, to shoulder more than just their own load. Take a man like Vince, 48 years old, pushing metal and pushing limits on the assembly line for 25 of them. He wasn't one for speeches, or even much small talk. He was the kind of guy who just appeared to absorb the noise and the grind, becoming almost a part of the steel and oil that defined his days, a permanent fixture in the symphony of industry. When you first looked at Vince, what you saw was the landscape of a life lived hard, carved deep. His face wasn't smooth like the guys who sat behind desks. It was etched with the fine lines of worry, tiny spiderwebs around his eyes from squinting at intricate parts, and the deeper grooves of countless hours under fluorescent lights that never quite seemed to chase away the shadows. A strong jawline, often set in a determined clench, hinted at the internal battles he rarely shared, the quiet resolve that kept him going even when he wanted to stop. His hair, once dark, was now mostly gray at the temples, cropped short and practical, like everything else about him. No fuss, no frills, just functional. He had a look that suggested he'd carried more than just his lunch pail to work every day. A silent catalog of quiet sacrifices and untold stories etched onto his very being. His shoulders, broad and solid, seemed to sag just a whisper, not from weakness, but from the cumulative weight of years spent lifting, pulling, and steadying things that were too heavy for one man alone. They were shoulders built for responsibility, even when he didn't fully acknowledge the breadth of what he was carrying. His clothes, usually a faded blue work shirt and sturdy jeans, were always clean but never new, testament to their hard wear and careful mending by Sarah, a quiet testament to their shared life of making do. He moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew every inch of his workspace, every quirk of the machinery, a silent, almost balletic dance perfected over decades amidst the clang and hiss of the factory floor. He was approachable, yes, but in the way an old oak tree is approachable, solid, enduring, but not necessarily inviting of casual conversation. But his hands, those were the real story. Knuckles thick as walnuts, skin rough as sandpaper, crisscrossed with a roadmap of small scars and old burns, each one a silent testament to a lifetime of wrenching, lifting, pulling, building. They were the hands of a man who knew how to make things work, who understood the tangible cost of progress, the sweat and the strain, the precision required to avoid losing a finger or worse. When he gripped a tool, it looked like an extension of his own bone and muscle, a natural fit. And his eyes, usually narrowed against the relentless glare of the overhead lights, held a quiet strength, an unwavering focus, sure, but also a deep-seated weariness. They were observant eyes, missing little yet often keeping their observations to themselves, almost as if recording everything for a private ledger. There was a distant, almost melancholic glint to them sometimes, speaking of untold stories of silent battles fought and won, and sometimes lost in the quiet hours of the night when the factory sounds faded and only his thoughts remained. You'd never pick him out of a crowd for a leader, not by the usual definitions. He was just Vince, another working man trying to make it to Friday, then Saturday, then Sunday, and start all over again. A man who, for the longest time, truly believed his job was simply to do his job and let everyone else do theirs. His head down, his focus on his own piece of the puzzle, watching the world through the narrow lens of his own tasks. The world for Vince began at 5 o'clock, not with a gentle hum but with the brutal screech of his alarm clock, a sound that tore through the pre-dawn quiet like a rip in old canvas. Sarah, his wife, would stir beside him, a soft murmur of discontent, but he was already halfway out of bed, the weight of the coming day already settling on his shoulders. Coffee, black and bitter, was his first ritual, a silent communion with the ghost of sleep. Then the worn work boots, the faded jeans, the company-issued shirt, each piece a uniform for the monotonous battle ahead. The factory floor was a beast that never slept. Its heart beat with the relentless clang of machinery, the hiss of hydraulics, the grinding roar of metal on metal. Vince spent his days feeding the beast, guiding colossal sheets of steel into massive presses, watching them stamped and shaped into components for things he'd never fully understand, just knowing they were crucial. He'd done it for 25 years, give or take, a quarter-century of the same sounds, the same smells of oil and hot metal, the same precise movements repeated thousands upon thousands of times. His body knew the dance better than his mind, his muscles anticipating the next motion before his brain even registered the cue. It was an honest living, hard-earned, etched into his very bones, but it was a living that barely kept pace with the rising tide of bills. Rent, utilities, the ever-increasing grocery haul for Emily, home from community college, and David, who was eating them out of house and home, growing like a weed. There was always a leaky faucet, a sputtering water heater, a tire that needed replacing on the old sedan. His modest, slightly worn, single-story house in the working-class suburb was a testament to his persistent, quiet efforts, always well-maintained, always a project half-finished. He'd patch one hole only to find another had sprung up somewhere else. It was a constant struggle, a relentless chipping away at what little piece he could snatch. He worked hard, saved where he could, but it felt like he was running on a treadmill, perpetually trying to outrun the next financial hit, never quite getting ahead, just staying afloat. He knew the cost of every spare part, the price of every hour of overtime, the exact weight of every dollar he earned, because he knew how quickly it all evaporated. In the quiet hum of the factory beneath the constant din, Vince carried another kind of weight. When the noise settled even for a moment, and his mind was free to wander, the ghosts of old dreams would stir. He'd always liked working with his hands, loved the satisfaction of fixing something, of building something that lasted. He'd once imagined a small workshop of his own, saw himself restoring antique furniture, maybe even crafting new pieces, working for himself, setting his own hours, making things beautiful again. But life had a way of drawing lines in the sand, and the demands of a young family, the need for a steady paycheck, had pushed that dream further and further into the background, until it was little more than a whisper, an echo of a road not taken. Now the gap between the man he was, a cog in a giant machine, and the man he'd once wanted to be, a craftsman, a creator, felt like an unbridgeable canyon. He feared failure more than anything. Not for himself, not really, but for Sarah, for Emily, for David. The thought of not being able to provide, of seeing disappointment in their eyes, that was the true monster under his bed. It made him keep his head down, made him internalize every worry, every setback. He rarely spoke up, didn't complain, even when the demands felt unreasonable or safety protocols seemed lax. What was the point? It wasn't his place. He was just Vince, and the factory, with all its grime and noise and endless demands, was his life. He often assumed the worst, a protective mechanism, a way to brace himself for the inevitable blows. Yet beneath the layers of resignation and gruff practicality, a quiet hope still flickered. A stubborn ember that refused to die, whispering that maybe, just maybe, things could be better. Not for him, perhaps, but for his kids. He kept it hidden, even from himself most days, burying it deep under the practicalities of earning a living. He just hadn't realized yet that the kind of hope he was looking for wasn't about what he could get for himself, but what he could give to others. He just hadn't realized yet that the kind of hope he was looking for wasn't about what he could get for himself, but what he could give to others. The crack in Vince's hardened shell didn't come from some grand, earth-shattering event. It came in the roar of a misaligned press, the shrill shriek of metal on metal, and the wide, terrified eyes of a kid named Leo. Leo was new, barely out of high school, and had been on the line for about 2 months. Vince had watched him, same as he watched everyone. He'd seen Leo stumble over settings, seen him almost trip over loose wires, seen the constant furrow in his brow as he tried to keep pace with the relentless rhythm of the machines. Vince had noticed the signs, the exhaustion, the way Leo chewed on his lip when he was concentrating, the subtle hesitation before hitting a crucial button. He'd seen Leo struggling to lift a heavy plate, saw him trying to figure out which lever controlled what, watched him fumble with the safety guard more than once. And every time Vince had looked away. Not my problem, he'd told himself. That's what supervisors are for. Don't get involved, Vince. Just do your job. Today, though, was different. The air in the plant was thick with the humid weight of a summer afternoon, the kind that made every breath feel like drawing soup into your lungs. The old ventilation system was straining, groaning, and the usual drone of machinery seemed to have an angry edge. Leo was working the heavy-duty stamping press, a beast of a machine that could flatten a car engine in a blink if you weren't careful. His job was to feed the raw metal sheets, ensure they were perfectly aligned, and then retract his hands before the massive ram descended. Simple, repetitive, dangerous. Vince was 2 stations down, feeding his own machine, his movements automatic, practiced. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Leo hesitate. A moment too long. Leo looked confused, his hand hovering over the start button. Vince saw the sheet metal wasn't quite flush against the guide, a hairline gap, but enough to cause a serious issue. He saw Leo's eyes darting to the supervisor, who was on the other side of the floor, preoccupied with a spilled pallet. Vince's mouth opened, a word forming on his tongue, "Wait!" But it stuck. It just wouldn't come out. The ingrained habit of silence, of non-interference, was too strong. Not my place. Then it happened. Leo pressed the button. The hydraulic ram descended with a sickening, accelerating whoosh. But the metal sheet, because of that hairline gap, wasn't properly seated. Instead of a clean stamp, it buckled, screamed, and then shot upwards, catching the edge of the descending ram at an impossible angle. A violent, ear-splitting screech ripped through the factory, followed by a shower of jagged metal shards that ricocheted off the concrete floor and nearby machines. Sparks flew, hot and bright like an angry welder's torch. The safety sensors, thankfully, killed the machine almost instantly, but not before a large, mangled piece of steel shrieked past Leo's head, embedding itself with a sickening thud into the wall behind him, barely an inch from where his ear had been. The entire line went silent, the usual cacophony replaced by a ringing echo and the heavy thud of the metal hitting the wall. Every head snapped towards Leo's station. The young man stood frozen, pale as the untouched metal sheets he was supposed to be stamping, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at the jagged hole in the concrete block. A thin line of blood trickled from a small cut on his temple where a shard had grazed him. The supervisor, Big Mike, came storming over, his face purple with rage. He didn't ask if Leo was okay. He didn't ask what happened. He just screamed, "What the hell, Leo? You trying to kill someone? You trying to take down the whole damn line?" Leo just stood there, shaking, unable to speak, tears starting to well up in his eyes. Mike kept yelling, threatening to fire him on the spot to send him home without a paycheck. Vince watched it all, feeling a cold knot twist in his gut. The fear on Leo's face, the humiliation, the almost certain end of his job, maybe even his life. Vince could have prevented it. He saw it coming, and he said nothing. That night's sleep was a cruel joke. Vince tossed and turned, the metallic shriek of the misaligned press echoing in his ears, louder than any alarm clock. He saw Leo's terrified face every time he closed his eyes, the thin trickle of blood on his temple, the way his jaw quivered as Mike tore into him. He saw the gaping hole in the wall, a stark monument to his inaction. At 3 a.m., he gave up. The house was a tomb of quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Sarah was asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even. Emily was probably dreaming of college, David of whatever video game currently held his fascination. Vince slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and went into the living room. He sat in his worn armchair, the one with the slight dip where he always sat, staring into the dark. The brutal honesty came then, a torrent he couldn't stop. "You saw it, Vince. You knew. You could have said something." The excuses he'd built up over years, "Not my place, not my problem, it's the supervisor's job," crumbled into dust. They were flimsy shields, nothing more than justifications for his own fear, his own quiet complacency. He wasn't just a cog in the machine. He was a silent accomplice to the machine's potential to break people. What had his life become? A man who kept his head down so religiously that he missed the suffering right in front of him. A man so afraid of stepping out of line, of inviting trouble, that he'd watch a kid almost lose his life, almost lose his livelihood, and say nothing. The image of Leo's face, pale and broken, merged with his own buried dreams, with the endless bills, with the silent anxieties he carried. It wasn't just about Leo. It was about all the times he'd seen things that weren't right, all the small injustices, all the struggles of his coworkers, and stayed quiet. It was about the man he was, a man defined by what he didn't do rather than what he did. The quiet hope he harbored for his kids, that stubborn ember, felt like a pathetic flicker in the face of his own inaction. He felt a profound sense of shame, heavy and cold, settling deep in his chest. It wasn't just a mistake he'd witnessed. It was a failure of the man he thought he was and the man he absolutely needed to be. That profound sense of shame, heavy and cold, finally broke him, not with a crash, but with a quiet, bone-deep shudder. He sat there as the first hint of gray lightened the edges of the horizon, and a single, unadorned thought solidified in the wreckage of his excuses. Enough. It wasn't a roar of defiance, wasn't a grand declaration to the universe. It was quieter than the hum of the refrigerator. It was the whisper of a man who had finally, truly, looked himself in the eye and found himself wanting. He didn't know what came next, didn't have a plan. He just knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't keep living like this. He couldn't keep his head down, not when keeping it down meant missing the signs, meant letting good kids like Leo flounder, meant becoming complicit in a silence that could wound, even kill. This endless, quiet resignation, it wasn't protecting anyone. It was just an easier way to live, but not a better one, not an honorable one. That was the hard truth, the one that tasted like ash in his mouth. He wouldn't be a man defined by what he didn't do anymore. He didn't need a fancy title or a supervisor's badge to see the damn truth. If you work alongside someone, if you share the same air, the same risks, the same struggles to pay the bills, then you have a damn responsibility to them. That was it. Simple as that. The alarm shrilled at 5 a.m., a shock to the system that felt different this morning. Usually it was a sound of dread, a summons back to the relentless monotony. Today it was a challenge. Vince rolled out of bed, the aches in his back and knees a familiar complaint, but beneath them a new tremor, a nervous energy. Sarah stirred beside him, murmuring something he didn't catch, and he just nodded, his mind already halfway to the plant. He went through the motions, coffee, toast, the same worn-out jeans and faded work shirt. Each movement felt deliberate, heavier. He saw David's backpack slumped by the door, Emily's college textbook on the kitchen counter, and the bills, always the bills, peeking from under a magnet on the fridge. These were his anchors, his reasons. He was doing this for them, yes, but also for the man he wanted them to see, the man he knew he had to become. The factory floor hit him like a physical presence. The metallic tang of oil, the rhythmic clang of machinery, the shouts over the din. It was the same world he'd inhabited for decades, but his eyes saw it differently. He walked past the punch press, the welding bays, the assembly line, each station a microcosm of effort and strain. His usual path was a straight line to his machine, a quiet nod to a few familiar faces, then head down. Today, that path felt less defined. He saw Leo back on the line, pale and still looking a little shell-shocked. Their eyes met for a split second, and Vince felt a fresh pang of guilt. He offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, something he might not have done before. Leo, surprised, nodded back, a flicker of something in his eyes. Vince got to his station, started his usual setup, the familiar motions a comfort, but his focus was split. He found himself scanning the floor, not for supervisors, but for the faces of the crew. It was a new habit, one that felt both alien and strangely compelling. Then he saw him, a new guy, no older than Emily, struggling with a stubborn bolt on the main conveyor belt, his brow furrowed in frustration. The kid was holding the wrench wrong, putting too much leverage on the head, risking stripping it. It was a small thing, a minor detail, but Vince saw it immediately. First instinct, the ingrained habit of years, was to keep working. Not my problem. He'll figure it out. Someone else will see. The old excuses, the comfortable silence coiled in his gut. He tightened a fitting on his own machine, his knuckles white. The fight was internal, brutal. His heart pounded. What if the kid snapped at him? What if the supervisor saw him interfering? He wasn't a trainer, wasn't a lead hand. He was just Vince, a guy who kept to himself. The shame from last night, the image of Leo's terrified face, flashed in his mind. He closed his eyes for a split second, took a breath that tasted like metal dust and resolve. He put down his wrench. Slowly, deliberately, he walked over. The kid looked up, startled, a deer in headlights. Vince didn't offer a smile, didn't try to be friendly. That wasn't him. "You're gonna strip that if you keep at it like that," Vince said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of judgment, purely practical. Gestured with his chin. "Push into the bolt, then turn. You're pulling it, not torquing it." He paused, then, feeling the awkwardness but pushing through it, added, "And you got the wrong size. Get a 1/2 inch, not a 13 millimeter. Close, but not right." The kid stared at him, then down at the wrench, then back at Vince. His face was a mixture of surprise and a faint blush of embarrassment. "Oh, right, thanks." He fumbled for a different wrench. Vince didn't wait for a reply. He just stood there for another second, a beat longer than he normally would, watching the kid switch out the tools and try again, this time with the correct technique. He saw the small victory in the kid's eyes as the bolt finally turned without resistance. Vince just gave another short nod and walked back to his own station, his heart still thrumming. It was a tiny thing, barely a whisper on the factory floor, but for Vince, it felt like he'd just pushed a stalled train. It felt hard. Oh, right. That first interaction with the kid, Leo, settled in Vince's gut like a half-digested meal. It wasn't the good feeling he'd vaguely imagined. It was just heavy. He kept glancing over, seeing Leo work, seeing him not make that mistake again, and a part of Vince wanted to feel proud. But mostly he just felt exposed, like he'd shown a card he usually kept close to his chest. What was that all about? The old Vince whispered, snickering in the back of his mind. Not your business, old man. Keep your head down. The next morning, the whisper was louder. Vince saw a new guy, not Leo, fumbling with a stack of sheet metal, struggling to get it onto the feeder without scratching the expensive finish. It was a two-person job, really. Vince's hand twitched, wanting to move, wanting to step in. But his feet stayed glued to the oily concrete floor. He watched, an uncomfortable knot forming in his stomach, as the new guy finally wrestled the metal into place, leaving a faint but visible gouge along the edge. Vince felt a familiar wave of relief that it wasn't his problem, swiftly followed by a sharp alien stab of regret. He'd seen it. He could have helped. He hadn't. That night, the gouge in the metal felt like a mirror to the one in his own conscience. Day 3 brought no reprieve. The factory hummed its endless, monotonous song. Vince found himself scanning the floor, his eyes no longer just tracking his own work but darting to the edges, to the struggling faces, the hurried movements. It was exhausting. Before, his vision was like blinders, only seeing the task in front of him. Now it was wide-angle, trying to take everything in, and it was overwhelming. He saw Leo again, actually doing pretty good, moving with a bit more confidence. A tiny, unbidden smile almost broke through Vince's usual gruff mask before he caught himself. Later that afternoon, another conveyor belt jammed, a frequent occurrence. Usually, Vince would just wait for the supervisor to call someone or for one of the usual suspects to jump in. Today, he watched a younger woman, Cassie, wrestle with a heavy crate, trying to clear the blockage by herself. Her face was red, muscles straining. Vince felt the familiar hesitation. My place, reflex. But then he saw the way she winced, a flicker of pain in her eyes, and suddenly the internal whisper of the old Vince sounded less like an accusation and more like a coward's excuse. He walked over. Didn't say anything, just put his shoulder against the opposite side of the crate. On 3, he grunted, his voice rough. 1, 2, 3. They lifted, strained, and the crate, heavy as it was, shifted, just enough for Cassie to maneuver it out of the way. She looked at him, surprise and gratitude warring in her eyes. Thanks, Vince, she breathed, wiping sweat from her brow. He just nodded that usual short nod and went back to his station. His shoulders ached and his back complained, but there was a different kind of ache too, the one that came from breaking years of habit. It was hard work, this new way of being. He considered just going back to how it was, easier, quieter. By day 7, the internal battle was a relentless drumbeat. Every shift was a conscious effort, a fight against his own ingrained apathy. He'd catch himself about to walk past someone struggling or about to ignore a small safety hazard, and a jolt would run through him. It was like trying to steer a ship against a powerful current, every push on the rudder demanding immense strength. He tried to offer advice to another new hire, Jimmy, about stacking pallets efficiently. Jimmy, a cocky kid still wet behind the ears, had just shrugged and said, "Yeah, I got it, old-timer." Vince felt a flush of anger, a surge of, "See, what's the point?" He retreated, spent the rest of the hour just pounding out his own tasks, stewing. He went home that night more exhausted than usual, not just physically, but mentally. Sarah asked him if he was okay. Just a long day. He mumbled, pushing his plate around, the weight of the factory floor still pressing down on him. He woke up on day 14 feeling like he was dragging himself through wet cement. The factory noise already seemed to grate on him more. He walked in, punched his time card, and for a solid 15 minutes he just stood by his machine, staring at the polished steel, his tools, the familiar shapes. He watched the others trickle in, laughing, complaining, just getting on with it. A wave of profound weariness washed over him. This is too hard. This is not for me. I can't keep doing this. Just go back to how it was. Just fade back into the background, Vince. It's safer there. He pictured Leo's face, not terrified, but now just working. Doing better. He pictured Emily, her earnest face poring over her textbooks, and David, his intense focus on his gaming. He pictured Sarah, her quiet strength, her unwavering belief in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. The thought of going back, of ignoring it all again, felt like a betrayal. Not just to Leo or Cassie or Jimmy, but to that quiet voice he'd heard at 3 a.m., the voice that said he was better than that. It wasn't about being a hero or getting a raise or even being thanked. It was about standing there, knowing he could do something and choosing not to. That was the real failure. He picked up his wrench. His hands, calloused and scarred, felt heavy but steady. He took a breath, pushed his shoulders back, and started his machine. The battle was far from over, but he hadn't surrendered. Not yet. The wet cement feeling didn't disappear overnight, but something else started to seep in. A quiet, persistent hum, like a machine slowly finding its rhythm. By day 20, Vince found himself instinctively reaching out. Not just when someone asked, but when he saw the hesitation, the furrowed brow, the subtle sign of a struggle about to erupt. There was a new kid, Hector, fresh out of trade school, trying to calibrate the plasma cutter. He was following the manual to the letter, but the old machine had its quirks, its own personality. Vince watched for a few minutes, seeing Hector's frustration mount, the tremor in his hands as he fiddled with the delicate settings. It was a mirror of Leo just months ago. Vince walked over, his heavy boots making hardly a sound on the concrete. "That old girl," he murmured, nodding at the cutter. "She don't like being told what to do by the book." Hector looked up startled, his face flushed. "Been trying for 20 minutes, Vince. It just won't take." Vince leaned in, his gaze sweeping over the console. "See this dial here? You gotta give it a little jiggle when you twist it. And hold the button down for an extra count of 3 after it clicks. She's stubborn." He demonstrated, his large fingers surprisingly gentle. The machine word then settled into a steady hum. Hector's relief was immediate, palpable. "Thanks, Vince. Seriously, I was about to call the supervisor." Vince just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible shift in the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smile, not exactly, but something close. He walked back to his station, the weight in his chest just a fraction lighter. Days turned into weeks. It wasn't a sudden grand change that announced itself with trumpets. It was a slow, steady accretion of small acts. He'd spot a loose screw on someone else's machine and tighten it without a word. He'd show Jimmy a quicker way to stack the finished parts, saving his back an ache. He'd catch Cassie before she hauled a too-heavy box by herself, stepping in and saying, "2 heads are better than 1, eh?" At first, people were surprised. Vince, the quiet man, the shadow on the floor. Then they just started to expect it. Not in an entitled way, but in a way that felt like reliance, like he was part of the fabric now, an active thread instead of just a loose end. A few times, Henderson, the supervisor, walked by, paused, watched Vince explaining a complex procedure to another new hire, then just nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. He didn't say anything, but Vince felt it, a quiet acknowledgement. The biggest shift, perhaps, wasn't in what Vince did, but in how he saw. His eyes, once focused inward or straight ahead at his own task, now swept the room, taking in the whole dance of the factory floor. He saw the potential hazards, the signs of fatigue, the moments when someone was about to make a mistake. He didn't just see machines and parts anymore. He saw the men and women operating them, their struggles, their small victories. He still carried the burdens of his own life, the bills, Emily's tuition, David's teenage moods, but they felt less crushing because now he carried something else too, a sense of shared responsibility. He wasn't in charge. He didn't have a new title or a bigger paycheck. He still clocked in at 5 a.m., still wore the same stained work pants. But the air around him had changed. His posture was a little straighter, his steps a little more purposeful. His silence, once a barrier, now felt like a quiet strength. When Sarah asked him one evening, "You've been humming to yourself a lot lately, Vince. Everything all right?" He just grunted, but inside a small, unfamiliar warmth bloomed. He was still Vince, but he was also more. He was seeing the world through new eyes, eyes that understood that taking care of the people around you wasn't a burden. It was just what you did. And in that simple understanding, he found a quiet, steady kind of hope he hadn't known he was missing. Weeks bled into months, each sunrise finding Vince at the factory gates, but the weight on his shoulders felt different now. It wasn't gone, not entirely. A man like Vince never fully sheds his burdens, but it had shifted, redistributed. He walked with an ease he hadn't known since his own youth, a quiet alertness in his eyes that missed nothing. Take the time young Mark, fresh out of trade school, was assigned to the old press. Mark was eager but clumsy, his hands still finding their rhythm. Vince, on the line nearby, saw him struggling with a jammed feeder. Mark was getting frustrated, trying to force it, his jaw tight. In the old days, Vince would have pretended not to see, or maybe grumbled about newbies. Now he just walked over, didn't say much, just slid his own wrench from his belt, gave Mark a look that said, "Let me show you." With a precise, almost imperceptible twist, Vince cleared the jam. Mark's eyes widened. "Thanks, Vince," he mumbled, a blush creeping up his neck. Vince just nodded, handed back the wrench, and went back to his own station. "No lecture, no, I told you so." Just a quiet transfer of knowledge, a small moment of care that saved Mark from a ruined part and a bruised hand. Or the time the new batch of materials came in, a slightly different alloy that reacted strangely to the standard cutting fluid. Supervisor Davies, a man who saw numbers more than people, ordered them to push through. Vince, though, had noticed the fumes were a bit acrid, the machines hum a little off-key. He started keeping a closer eye on Maria, who worked the cutting station. She had a touch of asthma. He saw her cough, her face pale. Instead of waiting for a health incident report, Vince found a moment when Davies was away. He walked over to Maria, casually started talking about the weather, then in a low voice suggested she try the old cutting fluid he had stashed away for personal use, said it worked better on tricky materials. Maria, surprised, tried it. The fumes lessened, her breathing eased. Vince didn't tell Davies, he just solved the problem for Maria. He hadn't disobeyed, he had simply cared. Slowly, imperceptibly, the atmosphere on the factory floor began to shift. It wasn't a revolution, not a banner-waving change. It was quieter than that. People started to look at Vince differently. Not as the boss, not as a leader with a title, but as the man you could count on. The new hires gravitated towards him, sensing his steady presence. The older hands, who'd known Vince as a silent, gruff force, found themselves catching his eye, sharing a knowing nod. When a machine made a new, unsettling whine, someone would inevitably glance at Vince, as if seeking his quiet approval or silent warning. He still didn't talk much, but his actions, his eyes, his unwavering presence spoke volumes. He was a silent sentinel, a quiet guardian. One afternoon, sitting on a greasy crate during his break, watching the organized chaos of the floor, Vince felt a peculiar sense of contentment settle over him. He watched Joe, the young man who'd been the trigger for all this, patiently showing a new worker how to calibrate a measurement tool. Joe spoke with a calm authority, his hands steady, much like Vince's had been. Joe even used some of Vince's own quiet phrases. Seeing that, a deep sense of rightness resonated within Vince. He thought back to how he used to see it, how he used to think being in charge meant having a fancy title, a corner office, or at least a different colored hard hat. He'd chased that idea quietly in his own head and found only frustration. But looking at Joe, looking at Maria, looking at the smooth, albeit still imperfect, rhythm of the factory floor, he realized something profound. Used to think being in charge meant having a fancy title. He murmured to himself, the words tasting real earned. He rubbed his calloused thumb over the worn leather of his belt. Now I know it just means looking out for the folks next to you, making sure they're all right. Doesn't matter if you're the boss or not. Doesn't matter if you got a shiny plaque or just grease under your nails. It just means you care enough to make sure no one else falls apart on your watch. And Vince, the quiet man of the factory floor, learned that some titles aren't given out in an office.